Anya had sought refuge in Astoria, a quaint coastal town nestled between the vast Pacific and the formidable Columbia River, hoping its misty mornings and artistic pulse would mend the frayed edges of her soul. Her Victorian rental, perched on a hill overlooking the river with its generous bay windows, was meant to be a sanctuary from the relentless grind of her East Coast past. She'd envisioned quiet evenings, the rhythmic sigh of the ocean, and the distant murmur of the town as her new lullaby, a stark contrast to the cacophony she'd left behind. Javier, her partner, a sun-kissed deep-sea fishing guide, embodied the very laid-back spirit Anya craved. His easy laughter and unflappable optimism were a constant balm, even as the autumn storms began to lash at their charming, albeit drafty, abode. Tonight, as the wind howled like a banshee through the eaves and rain hammered against the glass, Javier merely shrugged, suggesting they light more candles and enjoy the authentic Oregon experience. With a board game and hot cocoa dot, it was precisely 7 p.m. PST when the world outside their bay windows blinked out. One moment, the distant lights of the Astoria Megler Bridge shimmered like a jeweled necklace across the river. The next, an absolute profound darkness swallowed everything. The sudden cessation of light was so complete, so instantaneous that it felt less like a power outage and more like the very fabric of reality had been snipped. The initial reaction was a shared chuckle, a familiar annoyance that quickly morphed into a strange sense of novelty. Well, that's one way to enforce a digital detox, Anya joked, fumbling for her phone's flashlight. But the storm outside intensified its assault, the wind now a furious shriek, the rain a relentless drumbeat against the old house, sealing them in their suddenly fragile bubble. What followed the initial shock, however, was not the expected hum of generators kicking in or the distant wail of emergency sirens. Instead, an unnerving silence descended upon the town. The usual background symphony of Astoria, the low thrum of fishing boats, the melancholic blast of foghorns, the faint chatter from downtown pubs vanished. It was as if the very sound had been sucked out of the air, leaving behind an oppressive, almost suffocating quiet that pressed in on their ears. Anya felt the first prickle of unease then, a sensation that went beyond the natural anxiety of a blackout. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere, a feeling of being watched from the impenetrable blackness beyond their windows. A cold spot, despite the rising humidity from the storm, seemed to drift through the living room, brushing against her arm like an unseen presence. They tried their phones, but the screens remained stubbornly dark, no signal bars appearing. The landline was dead. The radio, when Javier finally found a battery-powered one, crackled with only static, a white noise that amplified the silence rather than breaking it. It became terrifyingly clear. This wasn't just their house. It was the entire city, cut off, isolated. Later, as Javier wrestled with a stubborn log in the fireplace, Anya distinctly heard it. A faint, almost melodic whisper, just at the edge of her hearing. It was too indistinct to make out words, but the tone was undeniably comforting, a soft, alluring murmur that seemed to promise solace. She shook her head, dismissing it as the wind playing tricks, or perhaps just the stress of the situation finally getting to her. But the whisper had stirred something deep within Anya, a primal fear of being truly alone, of being utterly disconnected. The darkness, which had initially felt like an adventure, now felt like a living, breathing entity, pressing in, testing the boundaries of her composure. She clutched Javier's hand, seeking the warmth of his presence in the encroaching chill dot as the first night of the blackout truly settled. The darkness in the old Victorian house felt heavier than mere absence of light. It was a tangible weight, a presence that seemed to absorb all sound, all warmth, all hope. The storm raged outside, a wild, untamed beast, but inside, a different kind of predator seemed to be stirring, a silent, insidious horror that whispered. Promises of oblivion. Morning arrived not with the gentle gray of dawn filtering through the windows, but with a continuation of the oppressive, inky blackness. The storm, if anything, had intensified, its relentless assault on the house mirroring the growing agitation within Anya. The power remained stubbornly out, and the air, thick with the scent of damp wood and stale fear, felt heavy and unbreathable. They attempted to establish a semblance of normalcy, brewing coffee over a camping stove and sharing a meager breakfast by flashlight. Javier, usually so resilient, moved with a noticeable slowness, his easy smile replaced by a drawn, worried expression. He kept glancing towards the windows, as if expecting the light to burst through the gloom at any moment, his optimism visibly eroding with each passing, silent minute. Anya, however, was experiencing something far more unsettling than mere anxiety. The whispers from the previous night had returned, clearer now, more insistent. They seemed to emanate from the very walls, from the shadows that danced just beyond the flashlight's beam. They were distorted, fragmented voices, sometimes barely audible, sometimes startlingly close, like someone breathing directly into her ear. The most terrifying aspect was the content of these whispers. They began to sow insidious seeds of doubt about Javier, twisting his innocent actions into something sinister. "He doesn't care," a voice would hiss, just as Javier would offer her a blanket. "He's hiding something," another would suggest when he rummaged through a drawer. Anya fought against them, trying to cling to her rationality, but the constant barrage chipped away at her resolve. Her paranoia began to bloom, a dark flower in the fertile ground of fear and isolation. She found herself watching Javier, scrutinizing his every move, every glance. Was that a flicker of something malevolent in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking? Did his casual touch feel less comforting and more possessive? The entity, whatever it was expertly exploiting her deepest, most buried anxieties about trust and abandonment. Javier, too, was clearly struggling. He would occasionally stop mid-sentence, his gaze fixed on an empty corner of the room, a bewildered frown creasing his brow. He complained of a persistent ringing in his ears, and once, Anya saw him flinch violently as if struck, though nothing was there. He became withdrawn, his usual easygoing nature replaced by a brittle defensiveness, snapping at Anya for minor things at around midday. A faint rapping echoed from the front door, a sound that startled them both in the profound silence. It was Maeve, her face pale and streaked with rain, her usual vibrant energy dimmed by the pervasive gloom. Her arrival brought a fleeting sense of relief, a connection to the outside world, but her eyes held a weariness that spoke volumes about the city's plight. Maeve, a local deeply steeped in Astoria's history and its more obscure legends, didn't dismiss their growing unease. Instead, she spoke of the hush, a local folklore term for periods when the natural sounds of the coast would inexplicably cease, often preceding strange occurrences. She spoke of old spirits, of things that drank the light and fed on the quiet, her voice hushed with a reverence that chilled Anya to the bone. "They say," Maeve whispered, her eyes wide, "that when the hush falls, you must keep the light, any light, burning. And you must never, ever, let this silence truly settle inside you." Her words, meant as a warning, only amplified the terror. The storm outside seemed to mock their feeble attempts at light, extinguishing candles with sudden gusts, making flashlights flicker erratically as the second night descended. A darkness even more profound than the first, the entity's influence became undeniably stronger. The whispers were no longer just suggestions. They were commands, insidious directives that urged Anya to distrust, to fear, to isolate herself further. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a suffocating cage, its walls closing in, trapping them with an unseen, malevolent presence. The dawn of the second full day brought no reprieve, only a deeper exhaustion that settled into their bones. Enya, Javier, and Maeve moved like specters, their faces gaunt, eyes bloodshot. The air in the house was thick with unspoken fear. The silence outside punctuated only by the relentless roar of the storm and the occasional, terrifying creak of the old house settling. Their nerves were frayed beyond repair, leaving them vulnerable. The whispers, now a constant, insidious chorus, had intensified their assault. They no longer merely suggested. They mocked, they taunted, They dug into the deepest recesses of Anya's mind, dredging up every past insecurity, every forgotten slight. "He never loved you," a voice would sneer, just as Javier reached for her hand. "She's judging you," it would hiss, as Maeve offered a worried glance. The entity's psychological manipulation had successfully driven a wedge between Anya and Javier. What began as subtle doubts had blossomed into full-blown accusations. Javier, increasingly agitated, would snap at Anya for imagined slights, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an invisible provocateur. Anya, in turn, found herself recoiling from his touch, convinced he harbored ill intentions, a puppet of the unseen force. Maeve, despite her own visible terror, tried desperately to maintain a semblance of control. She lit every candle they possessed, creating a flickering, inadequate barrier against the encroaching darkness. She mumbled prayers, her voice trembling, and spoke of ancient protective rituals. But her efforts seemed futile, like trying to hold back the tide with cupped hands against a force that transcended the physical. The entity began to manifest in more unsettling, though still subtle ways. Fleeting shadows would dance at the periphery of their vision, too quick to be real. Objects would shift imperceptibly, a book falling from a shelf, a door creaking open just enough to reveal a sliver of deeper darkness. A bone-chilling cold. Spot would linger, sometimes directly behind one of them, making the hairs on their necks stand on end. Anya's grasp on reality was loosening, each passing hour blurring the line between what was real and what was a product of the entity's insidious influence. She saw Javier's face contort into monstrous shapes, heard Maeve's voice twist into a mocking cackle. She would lash out, then immediately regret it, only to be consumed by the certainty that her reactions were justified. Javier's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would pace the house compulsively, muttering to himself, sometimes shouting at the empty air. Once, he lunged at a shadow in the corner, his eyes wide with terror, convinced something was there. His attempts to leave the house were thwarted by the relentless storm, and his desperation turned into a terrifying, almost animalistic aggression. Maeve, seeing their rapid decline, finally revealed the full, chilling extent of the local legend. She spoke of the Whispering Gloom, a parasitic entity born of the deep, cold silence that sometimes settled over the coast. It didn't just feed on fear. It consumed sanity, leaving behind hollowed-out husks, their minds shattered and their bodies mere vessels. It thrived on isolation, on the complete absence of human connection, and liked out in a desperate, unified surge of adrenaline, they decided they had to escape. They gathered what little supplies they could, their movements clumsy and panicked in the oppressive darkness. But the house seemed to resist, doors jamming, floorboards creaking ominously, as if the very structure was alive and holding them captive. The darkness outside the windows felt like a solid, impenetrable wall. The climax of the second night was a terrifying blur. Anya remembered a cacophony of whispers, a sensation of icy tendrils brushing against her skin, and Javier's guttural scream as he collapsed, unresponsive. Maeve was frantically trying to pull him up, her face a mask of primal fear. The house was alive with unseen movement, the air thick with a palpable malevolence. Anya knew, with a horrifying certainty, that they were losing. The third day dawned, if one could call it dawn in the perpetual gloom, but it brought no relief. The house was a battleground, not of physical struggle, but of shattered minds. Javier lay motionless on the living room floor, his eyes wide and vacant, a chillingly blank stare fixed on the ceiling. He was breathing, but there was no light. No recognition, no Javier left within those eyes. The whispering gloom had claimed him. Anya, her own sanity hanging by the thinnest of threads, knelt beside him, a guttural sob tearing from her throat. Maeve, huddled in a corner, was silently weeping, clutching a small carved wooden charm. The whispers were still there, a constant mocking hum in Anya's ears, but now they seemed to focus, to concentrate on her alone. They promised peace, an end to the terror, if only she would let go, if only she would embrace the silence. The entity, having consumed Javier's mind, seemed to swell in power, its presence in the house growing more tangible. Anya could feel its cold, insidious tendrils, reaching for her, coaxing her towards the same oblivion. She understood now, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that the whispering gloom didn't just feed on fear. It fed on connection, on the vibrant energy of human interaction, on the very light of consciousness. The Blackout was its hunting ground, a perfect stage for its feast. Just as Anya felt herself teetering on the brink, a faint, almost imperceptible flicker danced at the edge of her vision. Then another, and another. The lights of the Astoria Megler Bridge, distant and shimmering, slowly, hesitantly, began to bloom across the river. A collective gasp escaped Maeve's lips. The power was returning. The blackout was ending. But the return of light was not the joyous reprieve they had desperately craved. As the faint glow from the streetlights outside pierced the darkness, revealing the dust motes dancing in the air and the familiar contours of their living room, a new, more profound horror settled over Anya. The whispers didn't cease. They merely changed. They became more subtle, more internal, resonating not from the walls, but from within her own mind. She looked at Javier, his vacant eyes reflecting the returning light, and then at Maeve, whose face was etched with a terror that went beyond the blackout. The house, no longer a suffocating cage, now felt like a hollowed-out shell, a stage where a performance had just concluded. The storm outside had begun to subside, the wind a dying moan, the rain a gentle patter. The true victory of the entity was not in the darkness, but in what it had left behind. The physical blackout was over, but the internal one had just begun. Anya felt a cold, unsettling calm settle over her, a detachment from the horror she had just endured. The whispers were no longer terrifying. They were comforting, like an old friend, a familiar voice in the quiet chambers of her mind. Anya slowly rose, her movements strangely fluid, unburdened by the fear that had consumed her for days. She looked at Maeve, a faint, knowing smile touching her lips. The entity hadn't left with the darkness. It had merely found a new home, a new vessel. It had woven itself into the very fabric of her being, a silent, parasitic passenger. The haunting realization was this: the blackout was not an event, but an invitation. The whispering gloom didn't need the external darkness to thrive. It created its own within the minds of those it touched. And now, Anya understood with a chilling clarity that the true horror had only just begun. She was no longer just Anya. She was a host, a silent conduit for the entity that had found its way into Astoria, waiting for the next true blackout to spread its insidious influence.